All right.
All right. Thank you very much, Nikki, for
You're
all
welcome.
that. So we're a small, intimate group, and so there's advantages to that for sure. And so I think since we're a small, intimate group, it would be worthwhile just introducing each other to each other, and then we'll be able to know more about what others are interested in and co-create a session around that. And I think that's the power of the World curriculum as well. And rather than externally imposing information or a presentation on someone, basically the idea is that we can co-create it and things can emerge. So based on people's interests and based on people's passions, we can then create an environment or a space where we can discuss things that are relevant to people within the group rather than me just guessing what people would be interested in. And I'll just introduce myself briefly and then we can go from there. So my name is Carlo Ricci and I teach at a Faculty of Education in the Graduate Studies Department at the Schulich School of Education, actually, at Nipissing University. And my interests are largely in learner-centered democratic approaches. And I wrote a book called The World Curriculum, Unschooling and Self-Direction. And the subtitle of that book is What Do Love, Trust, Respect, Care, and Compassion Have to Do with Learning? And basically what I was interested in is that there are a lot of, in academic circles, a lot of people are talking about different types of curriculum. So there's a taught curriculum, there's the learned curriculum, there's the planned curriculum, and so on. But oftentimes when people talked about learner-centered democratic approaches, they would suggest that there is no curriculum. And so I was very uncomfortable about that suggestion that there would be no curriculum, because from my perspective, there always is some type of a curriculum. So it may not be an externally imposed curriculum, but there certainly is a curriculum, and the curriculum comes from within, right? So people get to decide what they want to learn, when they want to learn it, where they want to learn it, whether they want to opt in or opt out. And I think it's useful to have that terminology to add to the tradition of academic, what's already within academic research around the whole notion of curriculum. And this way, what makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I thought, might be mitigated by the notion of the world curriculum. So, when people talk about unschooling or other approaches that are learner-directed or self-determined, they often use terms like, well, we don't use a curriculum, or there's no curriculum. And so I thought, well, if we can then start talking about the notion of the world curriculum, then we could sort of, again, mitigate the discomfort that some people might have around there being nothing. And so in that way, we can talk about something that's concrete, and basically it would be the world curriculum. So it's about people following their own passions and people doing things that they love to do. And John Holt, when he wrote about or summarized all of his work, he said it comes down to two words: trust children. And so, that's also something that I feel is extremely important. And I think that not only do we have to trust children and trust that they know what their interests are and what their passions are, but we also have to create spaces and places where they can trust themselves, where they can learn to appreciate and respect themselves, where they can believe that the things that they're passionate about and the things that they're interested in are worthwhile, that these things are valuable, and it's not simply, that the only thing that matters is what the state says or what the principal says or what teachers say, but what matters is what their interests are. And so they have to be able to self-determine their lives in that way. And so, this is around the thinking that I was having when I was discussing this whole notion of the world curriculum and writing about it. And I was also interested in how do people learn best, or how do I learn best? And so obviously that is different for different people. Different people would have different responses to how they learn best. But that's, I think, the beauty and the value of learner-centered democratic approaches, and the beauty and value around unschooling and so on, and the World curriculum, is because it respects that whatever it is that the learner is interested in, and whatever way that they're interested in learning about those things, then that's legitimate, right? And I really like what John Holt says around this. He was asked, in issue 13 of Growing Without Schooling, there was a section there titled Going Back. And in it, this is what Holt says. A number of parents, perhaps half a dozen or so, have written to me to say that no one or more of their children have chosen, have written to me to say that one or more of their children have chosen to go back to school. They sound a little apologetic about this, as if they thought they had betrayed the cause, and he put that in quotes. But there is nothing at all to feel apologetic about. In the first place, unschooling is not a cause, in quotes. Our interest is not in causes, but in children and their growth, their learning, and happiness. And so I find that really inspiring to, even someone, to find that even John Holt understood and appreciated that ultimately it's up to the learner. And if the learner chooses to go to school, then, that's something that we need to respect. And as he phrases it, we're not interested in causes, but we're interested in children and their growth, their learning, and their happiness. So, in deciding how we learn best, part of my idea around that includes the notion of love, where we have to love and have a passion for things, and trust, where we have to trust, ourselves and others, put ourselves in trusting relationships and have others trust us, and we have to be able to trust ourselves. And this whole notion of respect and care and compassion and so on. And the other, point that I wanted to make in the book is that this isn't really new. The whole notion of the World curriculum is something that we all do as human beings, and we've been doing it probably forever. And basically, it's that we all learn this way. So it's not something new and something that's unique to particular, to a particular group, but it's something that we all do. And so what I was hoping that would come of it is that people would become more mindful of what they do when they're learning things that they have or that they are interested in, and learning things where they have a passion for, right? And think about what they do when they learn in those types of scenarios and in those types of situations, and then extend it to other areas of their life, and to recognize and become empowered to understand and believe that we are capable to learn things, and that we are capable of creating or self-determining our own path towards learning, however we choose to define it and move forward in that way. So I think it's really inspiring to the attempt is to get a lot of recognition from people about how capable we actually are to learn in these types of situations and scenarios. And from my own perspective, we have to ask the question, well, what does a world that's truly educated look like? Are we currently living in a world that's truly educated? And so the other part of this that I've been thinking, since and continue to think about is that if we have a world where there is still tensions and wars and conflict and poverty and hunger and premature deaths and all of these types of things, then even if all of us have PhDs, if you consider that to be the pinnacle of schooling or education or whatever you want to call it, then I still don't think that we're a learned society. But if we can create a world where there's less conflict and peace and people get along and we help each other out and there's a lot of cooperation, then whether you're schooled or not doesn't matter. But I think that ultimately that's an indication that we are living in a world where people are truly educated, where we're truly learned individuals. And so I think that's the power of a lot of this. And again, I think that the more opportunities people have to self-determine what really matters to them, the better off we'll all be, because we create a world where people are much more in tune with themselves and with their communities and with the world that they live in. So, if we're destroying the planet, then how could that mean that we're educated, right? And, from a lot of the arguments made by unschoolers and people who are into learner-centered democratic approaches talk about how, well, it's those who have a lot of schooling sometimes that make decisions that many of us will think are, not the best decisions to make, right? So they'll send us to war or do things that might not be in the best interest of the world that we live in. And so simply by having letters after your name doesn't guarantee that you're, in my definition, a learned person, because I would imagine that a learned person would have a lot of wisdom, and if somebody who has a lot of wisdom wouldn't live their lives in ways that are so destructive. So let me just pause there, and I noticed that a few other people joined the group. So at this point, I just want to invite people to either in the chat or feel free to take the mic and speak, and you can raise your hand if you like as well. If there's more than one person speaking at a time, I guess we'll just take turns. And I'm just curious as to what other people think and what other contributions, or if you have any questions or comments or anything that I've said resonates with you or doesn't resonate with you, because ultimately I'm hoping that our session will be one where it will be interactive and it won't just be me talking, but it'll give us an opportunity to co-create the session, again, in the spirit of emergence, and we'll go from there. So go ahead if anybody would like to either ask a question and if you'd like to talk, you'll notice there's a talk button up top. So you just click the talk button and that'll give you an opportunity to talk. And if you want to chat, you just there's a smaller rectangular box and you can go into the chat. So Arvinda just said, I think that if schools did not have grades and attendance, there would be room for many of the ideas that we value. And I think that's a powerful point, because I think personally, I think that grades are one of the things that really diminish learning within the context of any learning situation. And we know from others like Holt and Daniel Pink and so on, where they talk about this whole notion of that, Holt talks about how grades create fear and anxiety. And we know that fear and anxiety are not conducive to learning. And so, rather than schooling as we know it enhancing learning, it actually diminishes learning because it creates that fear and anxiety. And we don't need fear, anxiety, grades, punishment, bells, any of those things in order to have learning. So we could learn without a lot of those things. And in my own teaching, I try, again, to diminish the importance of grades as much as possible. And I try to subvert the whole notion of grading so that we begin to recognize that it's not about the grade, it's not about the number, but what it is it's about learning, and it's about, living better lives. And so, again, I like the quote from William James. William James says, act as if what you do makes a difference, period. It does. And so I think that's extremely important, that we have to recognize that we can all make a difference. And I would just like to couple that quote with one from Gandhi. And Gandhi says, as human beings, our greatness lies not so much in being able to remake the world, that is the myth of the atomic age, as in being able to remake ourselves. And so we're a part of the world, and so if we change ourselves, inevitably we would be changing the world that we live in, since we're a part of the larger world that we live in. And so, you know, can you make a difference if you're, working in the context of an institution like schooling? Well, maybe you can and maybe you can't, but it's up to the individual to decide that. And the other empowering thing for me has always been that there's a lot more to the day than schooling, right? And there's a lot more to the day than, than relationships with those who are considered quote unquote students. So of course we try to do the best we can in those particular environments, but this type of worldview is not just about teacher-student relationships, but it's about relationships, period. It's about how we interact with each other. It's about how we interact with all of those people and that we come in contact with, and all of, that is on the planet that we come in contact with, right? So it's about how we treat everything. It's like a global cosmological worldview. And so what we have to continue to think about is not just teacher-student relationships. And if that's all we think about, I think we've missed a lot of what value this might have. But it's about how we interact with everybody that we come in contact with. And it's about how to create relationships that are very positive in all contexts. So for whatever reason, if you're within the context of a school and you can't do the things that you wish you could do, then I think it's important to recognize that there are places and spaces where you can make a difference. And so focus on the differences that you can make. And so Jackie just also in the chat mentions, agree, love teaching, hate grading. Grades also create power over someone else, very toxic. And again, I agree with that. And I think that, for me, I think they're very much manipulative, right? And so what I mean by that is that when we grade, it's dehumanizing not only for the individual that receives the grade, but it's also dehumanizing for the person that gives the grade. And so that's why I try to resist that by subverting the whole notion of grades within the context of my own life. And you're absolutely right, I think, is that grades are ways of manipulating people, or it's a way of manipulating people to get them to do things that they would otherwise choose not to do. So they're extremely toxic. And so I'm glad that there are others who share that same view and see things in that way, because I think that's a positive first step. And the more we could diminish the importance of grades and create evaluation-free spaces and places as much as we can, I think the better off we'll all be towards becoming or moving towards a more humane world, right? Even when grades do not cause fear or anxiety, I got all as, for example, they interfere with learning. And then Eleanor says, yes, it takes away the focus from learning. And children should actually be present by choice. So I think there's a lot of positive comments from my perspective, from my worldview within the chat. And I think that, the more choice people have, the more freedom people have, then, with freedom comes responsibility, I think, and the better off we will be in the long run, right? You can't place people in institutions and have them stay in institutions for so much of their life and then expect that when they get older, they're going to be able to live within a democratic context. And so if we're truly interested in democracy and freedom and responsibility, then I think we need to create spaces and places where people can be free and can be responsible and can live in democratic ways, so that it could then transfer from their, their child-rearing practices to their to continue throughout their whole life. And again, having children be present by choice, I think, is a very powerful idea as well, because we need to respect people and we need to respect other human beings. We can't impose our worldview on others, and so we have to allow people to find places and spaces where they feel comfortable, where they feel passionate about. And the more we do that, I think the better off, again, we'll be in the long run to creating a more humane world. And the more we impose, then I think the more difficult it becomes. And we know from works, like John Taylor Gatto and so on, they talk about how schooling was never about freedom and liberation, and it was always about control. And in schools, as Gatto points out in his book, The Underground History of American Education, and I love the subtitle, which is an intimate investigation into the prison of modern schooling, that school started in Prussia, and others recognized that they created this new technology called schooling, and that they were trying to find ways to, import that into their own world. And the reason why they wanted to is because they felt that it was a brilliant technology that can be used to control people's minds, bodies, spirits, and emotions. And we can see that still, the remnants of that still, within the mainstream schooling system, when we have all kinds of, examples of how schools are very undemocratic places and spaces. And of course, they don't have to be that way, because we have examples of schools that are more open and free and more learner-centered, democratic, like the Sudbury Valley schools and the Albany Free School and the Manhattan Free School and so on and so forth. And so, we don't need such a rigid system that's undemocratic in order to learn. And again, as I think a lot of you have mentioned as well throughout the chat, is that it actually diminishes learning when we create these types of environments rather than respectful, open, trustful environments where people can learn in ways that they're really interested in and really passionate about. And, schools should be like the library, in the chat again, wherever you come and where you can go and come as you please. And then it says, note, my ex's mother did not make the children go to school if they did not want to, because she knew if she forced them to go, they would not learn anything anyways. Her thought was, why fight with the children to get them up and to school if they would not be able to comprehend and retain anything? They would not be able to really learn anything anyways. And Rockwell also agrees and talks about, especially with the technology we have available to us. And then there's notions of Alfie Kohn's work around punish by rewards. And again, I agree, that's, Alfie Kohn is more along the lines of probably a progressive educator, and maybe we would not agree on everything, but there's certainly a lot of overlap between the types of things that he talks about and the types of things that I talk about and a lot of you are talking about. And this whole notion that when we're rewarding people, it's still a form of punishment, right? And I think it's a very powerful idea, and Holt talks about that as well. That, Holt says that it doesn't matter if you get people to do things that you want them to do with a hammer or with a smile, it's still manipulative in that way, right? And so they still lose touch with themselves. And from my perspective, I think it's so important that we allow people to discover who they are, find out what interests they have, and to know themselves. So that way they can bring the powerful gifts that they have within to the rest of us in the world. And I think that's a very nice way of thinking about things, in my mind anyway. And Aravinda is also saying that even my parents let me stay home whenever I wanted. And I think we're very fortunate to have been in a situation like that. And, as a parent, I have two girls age 8 and 10. For me, it's the same thing. Like I definitely agree that I need to give them freedom, and I need to give them the space and place for them to make decisions about what they're interested in and so on. And unfortunately, so many of their friends and so many of their don't have the same level of freedom. And so I make it a point to share with my children this worldview and philosophy, and to share with them about how lucky they are to be in a place and space where they have certain freedoms that even their own friends can only dream of having. And there's no, it's almost as if, because largely I consider myself to be a child advocate, and so I think that unfortunately children are the last acceptably oppressed group in the world that we live in, and we have to create more spaces and places where children could be free, and more examples of how children thrive when they are given the opportunity to explore learning in very open, free, authentic, genuine ways. And, with my own children, they have the freedom to decide whether they want to go to school or not, whether they want to, the types of foods they eat, sleeping patterns, those decisions they have to make. And it's not that this is where some people get confused when we talk about learner-centered democratic approaches, because sometimes people forget about the word democratic. So it's not that they have total choice to overrule everything that happens, and to, that I would be a total subservient to every single need that they have. But the whole notion of democracy is that we all have needs, and so we have to be respectful of each other. And so we all have to live within our own community in ways that we respect each other. So it's not that I would give up my authority for their authority, and so on and so forth. But what we will do is we will try to create places and spaces where we can come together and live in very open, democratic ways, in very authentic ways, in very genuine ways, where and so many times I think that my idea is going to be the one that we're going to move forward with. And I've learned that it's not always the case. And often with my own children, they come up with some very, very insightful ideas, and ones that I didn't even think of. And so when we have conflict or disagreements about things, we all try to figure out a way to make everybody, place everybody in the position that they choose to be in. And is that possible 100% of the time? No, but it's pretty possible most of the time, a lot of the time. And when situations arise where it can't be, because they understand and appreciate how much freedom they usually have, and I, feel the same, then it would be easy for one of us to say, all right, this time I'll stand aside and we'll follow, we'll do what you agreed to do, and so on. But it's amazing how when we put our heads together, how something that seems so complex and unresolvable really quickly becomes an easy solution, right? And even and I'm not talking about huge complicated decisions, but even for everyday decisions. I have to go out, what are we going to do about it? And so, there are choices. They can stay home by themselves, they can go to a friend's place, and so there are always situations or scenarios that can happen that is, very, where the solutions are very democratic. So I'll just read a few more comments from the chat. My youngest was in a Montessori school, no grades up until grade 8. High school frustrated her because of the grades and traditional structure. And it's unfortunate that learning is something that people are so passionate about, but once we put it in particular contexts, then people quickly, they lose interest in what their passions are because of situations and scenarios like that. So I think that's something that that we have to continue to think about, and that us that is a big reason we are changing things and unschooling our son. And I also do volunteer work for the Ontario Federation of Teaching Parents, and it's a homeschool organization here in Ontario. And I field hundreds of calls from people who are interested in getting more information about homeschooling and unschooling. And some people call because they knew right from the beginning that they're interested in unschooling or homeschooling, and that's something that they wanted to do. Whereas others, they call and they have, interests around, they've tried so many different things, and ultimately they feel that they have no other choice. And so they're looking for something different. And that's why I think it's so important for those of us who do this type of work to continue to do this type of work and to continue to offer spaces and places where people can continue to focus and help each other understand the advantages of this type of an environment. And so, again, of the calls that I field, there are so many where people they share how they're so frustrated by the situation that they're in, and they're so desperate, and they're so glad that there are people like us, whereby we can continue to advocate for spaces and places where they can escape. And John Holt talks about the best he can do is to create a hole in the fence and allow people who want to escape. And back to the quote that I read you from Gandhi, it's, as human beings, our greatest lies not so much in being able to remake the world. That is the myth of the atomic age, as in being able to remake ourselves. So again, trying to create and think that the best we can do is, we have to change everything about the world before we become successful isn't the case. All we have to do is create our, change our context, and sometimes we act as examples for others. And, that's, I think, how the movement becomes so powerful is through this bottom-up approach rather than a top-down restructuring of things. So we have to continue to advocate and create these places for people to thrive. So I just want to read more of the chat because I think people are putting in some very nice and parallel comments within there, and sometimes it's difficult to talk and focus on other things while at the same time focusing on the chat. So this was decades ago. I think schools have a more strict attendance policy nowadays. And then for sure there's agreement around that. I loved school and never missed a day. That's really funny. So, and from the Will's curriculum perspective that we talked about before, and from the quote that I read you from John Holt, and there are a couple of things to say around that. And if you had a positive schooling experience, or you think that your schooling experience was positive, then depending on what type of a context you were in, as John Holt says, unschooling is not a cause, in quotes. Our interest is not in causes, but in children and their growth, their learning, and their happiness. So I think we have to be open to listen to the learner, even if the learner decides that ultimately where they want to be is within the context of schooling. Now, I think that it's also valuable to have a deeper conversation from a critical theoretical perspective around the whole idea of schooling. And even if you went to school and you got straight A's and whatever it is, I'm not sure when you say that you loved school for what reason you loved school, but it could be varied. But sometimes I think it's important to just take a step back and say, well, as Kristen Olsen writes in her book, Wounded by School, where she argues, and I would argue that almost all of us who've been through the schooling system have been wounded in some way, right? Maybe by being forced to follow other people's ideas of what knowledge is, of what learning is, of what you should be doing, really changes you fundamentally, right? Schools are not neutral. It's not like there's a very, neutral type of schooling environment that you can go through and come away unscathed. But it's based on worldviews, and we all have different worldviews. Some of us believe that, schooling is meant to do one thing, and others believe that schooling is meant to be another. And so what happens if you find yourself in a position where you're in a particular environment where your worldview doesn't align with the particular worldview, or your interest or passion doesn't align with the interest or passion of schools? And so back to the notion of Alfie Kohn's work and even Holt, where they talk about this whole notion of punish by rewards. Well, again, we have to think about, even when we're being rewarded within the context of school, is there moments and significant moments where we become wounded by that experience because we are not allowed to discover who we are, because we're constantly being told what to do, when to do it, how many words to do it in, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really powerful discussion. And Irma, if you would like to say more about that, I would be happy to hear your thoughts on it. And if you'd like, you can pick up the talk button and share. But of course, I don't want to put you in a position where you feel that you have to do that. But thank you for making that comment, because I think it also sheds some really important light on other things that we need to consider as we go through. And there are others too. I liked it too, but sometimes I didn't go. That was okay with my parents and okay with my teachers too, because no one doubted me. I don't know if it is so easy to do that today. And so, again, that whole notion of freedom, I think, is so important, and the ability to make those types of decisions and to have those types of decisions respected, I think, are also extremely fortunate for those who've experienced that. And you would like to think that more people would experience something like that, or continue to experience it as well. And then Irma says, it isn't, if you extend your holiday on either side, you are penalized in some way. And again, that also raises some very interesting points. And I want to thank everybody for their comments in the chat, because I think what you're doing is you're really inspiring me and hopefully others to think about some very important ideas. And again, this is the whole notion of the world curriculum, where we're co-creating, and the presentation emerges as we work together to create an environment and discuss things that are of interest for all of us within this particular community, rather than there being an externally designed, pre-planned presentation where others within the community may not even, without knowing people within the community, it's very difficult to create something that would be of interest and resonate with people. But by, seeking guidance, and by dialoguing and conversing with each other back and forth, I think, through the chat and my audio, I think that we co-create a much more worthwhile and valuable, experience for all of us. And, it's ridiculous, because I think part of what you're saying, Irma, about this whole notion of you're penalized in some way if you don't, this whole notion of going on holiday, is that, the message around that is that only what happens in school is important. That's the learning. And the best definition for learning I can share with all of you is that from John Holt, where John Holt says, living is learning. And as we live our lives every day, we learn things. And I think that's extremely powerful, to recognize that that needs to be the case, right? And, as we live our lives, we learn things, is essentially the motto. And so it's not just in schooling, and as we've been, hinting at, that maybe schooling diminishes even that learning experience. But we can learn constantly, whether we're at home or out somewhere or wherever we are. Learning happens in very powerful ways. And that's part of why, even within the context of this framework, this technology, Blackboard Collaborate, and I use Blackboard Collaborate also in my own teaching at my institution. And I choose not to put limits on what people can do. And so the first thing I do when I come onto the Blackboard is open all features so that everybody has access to as much as I can give people access to. And you can see that there have been some works of art that have happened on the whiteboard, and people are still creating artistic works of art there. And I think it's a positive addition to the whole experience. And so rather than preventing people, I remember when I first was at a workshop for Blackboard Collaborate, they were sharing with me that it's such a good technology because I could control what everybody has access to, and I could prevent people from doing particular things so that they won't be distracted with the whiteboard or in the chat, and their focus will be 100% on things that I'm saying, because the idea is, and the assumption is, that whoever the presenter is, or whoever the speaker is, or the teacher is the person that can contribute most to the experience. But, you know, from my perspective, clearly that's not the case. And, you know, if you go back and look at the fantastic discussions that have been happening in the chat, if I disable that, so much of the richness of this particular experience will also be diminished and limited by not having the opportunity to listen to the voices that are coming through in the chat, which I think is contributing immensely to how valuable this particular presentation is, for me anyway. So, you know, again, I continue to thank people for your comments and your insights, because I think that it really creates a worthwhile environment for all of us. And Velosia talks about my ex and his sister made good grades because of the fact she let them stay home. And Betty talks about this whole notion of conformity. And, you know, again, these are different. I'm assuming that that's a comment, you know, the conformity notion is a comment on the one that was made prior. And so here comes a tension, right? We all have worldviews. We all have ideas about what learning is, what teaching is, what schooling is, what knowledge is important. And I think that whether we're aware of it or not, these worldviews exist within our being. And so what we have to do is, you know, they're extremely important to be aware of, largely because the reason why it's so important is because of how it plays out in people's lived experiences. So if you're a teacher in a classroom that really thinks grades are everything, or if you're a parent that thinks that your decisions override anything that your children might be thinking, then of course that particular worldview, that particular philosophy really changes how people interact with each other. It really changes the amount of freedom that people have, the amount of you know, opportunities that they have for being authentic and genuine. And so that's why I think that, you know, the more we see things in that way, the more, you know, we focus on what our worldviews are, then hopefully we'll be able to see what the implications of it are and what the limitations of it are. And if we see and, you know, consult others who have different worldviews, then we could come back together and sort of think about these things, right? So when you're talking about making good grades, well, is the idea of making good grades, does that mean conformity? And I'm assuming that that's what that particular exchange is referring to. And again, I think that that's a really important thing to start to think about. Is it about good grades? Is that what conformity is all about? And let me just continue to move on. Schooling makes it easy to predict and thereby manipulate market behavior. And again, that's another point that is worth considering. And this whole notion of schooling and the connection between schooling and the neoliberal and neoconservative worldview. So who creates schooling? Who decides what we do within the context of schooling? And what agenda do they have? What is it that they're benefiting from, right? So is schools a way to get people to conform, to comply, to get used to the notion of obedience, and to lose connection with their true interests and their true passions so that they can then serve a more capitalistic worldview? And, is everything about capitalism bad? No, of course not, right? Is everything about socialism good? No, of course not. But I think what we have to do is we have to figure out what's good about it, this whole notion of democracy and freedom and those types of things, and try to create a world that's better for all of us that are living within the world. And, again, I just want to reiterate the point I made at the beginning in case some of you weren't here for it. But for me, we have to ask ourselves, what does a learned world look like? What does a schooled world look like? What does an educated world look like? And if we continue to treat each other in ways that are disrespectful, and if there's still poverty, and if we're exploiting other people to serve our own ends, then no matter how much schooling we have or no matter how learned we think we are, we're not, right? And just think about a world where everybody gets A's, everybody gets A pluses, level 4s, or however they choose to categorize it, 100%. Everybody gets PhDs, but there's still poverty and there's still injustices that are avoidable, and there's still all of these types of tensions that are there. We're still destroying our planet, and we're not engaging and rather than helping each other, what we're doing is we're competing with each other and so on. Then I don't think we could say that we live in an educated space and place, right? That we're living in an educated world. So I'm just going to continue to read on. I was just at World Domination Summit in Portland. Chase Jarvis spoke about so much of this in his keynote. Creativity is the new literacy, and creativity and connection to the earth, and then yes, and so on. And again, I think if we value creativity, if we want people to be imaginative and creative, then we have to create spaces and places where we allow them to practice what it means to be creative, to use their imagination, to do those things that I think are so important, right? And so if we tell people what to do, when to do it, how to do it, what color pencil crayon to use, and to conform to this and focus on that, and then we judge them and ensure that they follow all of our directives, I think what we're doing is we're not creating a very creative and imaginative opportunities for people, right? But what we're doing is the opposite. And so if we're interested in creativity and we're really interested in allowing people to use their imaginations, then rather than creating a narrower curriculum, then what we have to do is we have to broaden our idea of what it means to learn. And that's, again, this whole notion of the willed curriculum, where the willed curriculum is as broad as the individual that comes into that particular space. And so I think that that's extremely important to, to creating and to creativity. And then Debbie says, thank you, Irma. We tie everything back to laws of nature and the universe. Aranda, my parents had no big philosophy. They just had no doubt that I could decide when to go and when to stay home. They didn't even consider themselves democratic. They definitely thought that they were the authority. So again, there's not one, as human beings, we're complex, right? So even within the context of our worldviews and our philosophies, It's not that you're pure holistic or you're pure, you know, an essentialist, or you're a pure idealist, or you're a pure humanist or behavioralist, or, you know, there's a lot of lines that blur. And when you say that my parents had no big philosophy, I think that all of us do. And, you know, I would have to suggest and say that, you know, my thinking is that whenever we act, we're acting based on our own values and beliefs. And we may not really think about what they are, but we do have them. And the decisions that we make are based on our particular worldviews. And so to say that when you say they just had no doubt that I could decide when to go and when to stay home, I think there are assumptions that they're making. They must have you know, they're working on a particular philosophy, right? Because other parents wouldn't be like that. They have different ideas, different worldviews. And so they would say, well, no, my children can't go, can't make those decisions. It's up to me. You have to go to school. You have no choice. And, you know, that would be a particular worldview. So your parents' worldview is definitely there, I think. I think we all have what critical theorists call discourses that run through our everyday decisions that we make. And I think it's important to sort of think about what those discourses are. But, you know, again, we may disagree on that, and I think that's healthy to have disagreements as well as agreements. Each has a different rhythm, different food needs. And I think that that's powerful too, because this whole notion of different food needs and different rhythms, I think our bodies, if we lose touch with our bodies when we don't allow people to listen to their bodies. And I remember I was talking to a situation where there was a young child, and she went to the doctor, and you know, the parent said, well, she has a little bit of a problem when, you know, with going to the bathroom, you know, evacuating. And so the doctor said, well, you know, do you eat fruits and vegetables and so on and so forth? And the child said, was, you know, listening in the background, and said, yes, of course, I eat and salad. You know, she said, I eat salad too. So there's this recognition that's happening, and there's this becoming in tune with their particular body. So the story, as the story goes, the child then at some point says to their parents, I think I need to have some more bran because, you know, that issue is coming up again. So I think what that does is it empowers us to understand how the foods we eat impact our bodies. And, you know, I still see parents force-feeding their children and getting them to eat everything that's on their plate in the name of this is the best interest of the child. And I know what that particular best interest is. And so I think that we're doing people a disservice when we impose things like that and don't allow them to learn about their bodies, learn to listen to what happens when you eat healthy food versus unhealthy food, or these types of foods versus that food. And I think a lot of the, you know, issues we have with obesity and so on are because, you know, so many young people were force-fed or not allowed to listen to their body. So you can't have dessert until you finish your important meal. So you stuff yourself with your important meal, and then, you know, even though you have no more room for dessert, you have it anyway because that's what you really wanted in the first place, and so you just indulge on things. But if we had allowed young people and all people the opportunity to listen to their bodies, have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, then, you know, things become very, very different. And when I look at my own children who have the freedom to create their own diet, they actually have, on many occasions, they eat a much healthier diet than I do. And it's a myth to think that if you don't force children to eat certain things, all they'll do is eat chocolate and whatever it is, you know. Since they can have that whenever they like, often they choose not to have it, and they'd rather have something else because their bodies are telling them that that's what they need. So, you know, they learn to become responsible people and to eat in very healthy ways because they have opportunities to make those types of choices. And, go on to say here, Aravinda again, if I want to quit school entirely, they probably would have said no. Big question. When kids are young, what they will is sometimes hard to tease out. Exposure to new things and ideas can inspire, but what to do when a child isn't sure about his interests? What she wills, this is creating anxiety in our house currently, sometimes easier to fix with some traditional curriculum during the day. But is this wise or just confusing? Again, there are no recipes, so it would be very difficult to say, Terry, that this is what you should be doing or this is what you shouldn't be doing, because you know your context, you know your environment, and you know your situation. But, you know, not knowing any of that, I think that it would be important to ask questions around, you know, what types of interests do they have, and are we shutting down some of their interests, right? So let's say the child wants to watch a lot of television. And if we say, no, you're not allowed to watch TV, then does that mean what we're saying to them is, or I think what we're saying to them is, that what you're interested in isn't important. So we have this worldview, this assumption that TV is bad. But I think we have to ask ourselves, well, is TV really a bad thing, right? I mean, there are people, friends that I have who are academics that have done a PhD, and thankfully they were able to do it from their perspective because they watched a lot of television. And so they've done a PhD in cultural studies where they were doing work around particular TV programs. And so in order for them to have achieved what they have achieved, what they required to do is to watch a lot of TV. And, you know, if they just want to be silent, is that a bad thing, right? Sometimes it's important to allow people to be introspective and silent. So we may think that people are not doing things, but yet they may be doing some very important things in their own life in order for them to continue to move forward in the way that they need to move forward. And so it might be that our worldview is simply not aligning with their worldview. And so what we're doing is we're assuming that the types of things that they're doing is not important, but the types of things that we're thinking about is extremely important. So I think a conversation needs to happen there.
Hi, Carlo. This is Debbie. I'm the moderator. I just wanted to let everyone know it's about 2:58 and the next session is going to begin at 3 p.m.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think what I'll do is I'll start winding down because I want to make sure people have enough time to go into their own session. So I just want to thank everybody, and I think that your insights have really inspired me, and I really enjoyed our time together and interacting with all of you. If you need to get in touch with me or you would like to get in touch with me, I'll put my email in there again, and I would be happy to connect with others if they want to continue the conversation in some way. So it's carlor@nipissingU.ca. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope that our paths will cross again soon. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference and your sessions. Bye for now.